Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my little bolt tutorial. In this video we're going to have a look at a couple of tips and tricks. I'm going to show you a couple of plugins that I find useful, and the main subject of this video will be creating a wireframe render of the subdivided mesh of the two bolts we created in the last video. First of all, I want to thank John Dickinson, who sent me a link to one of the videos he did on modeling a hex-shaped bolt in Cinema 4D. And although it's a Cinema 4D tutorial, since he only uses standard modeling tools to create that bolt, you can easily translate the techniques to Blender. So if you want to, go ahead and give it a try. I'll post a link to John's video in the video description below. I would also like to thank Tommy for kicking my butt again about the things that I could have done better. So we're going to have a look at some of the tips he provided. The first one is about subdividing, and I've already prepared a scene here to speed things up a little bit. If I select this flat object here and tab into edit mode and go to vertex mode here, and I'll just deselect the center vertex, you can subdivide these selected vertices. And what I did in the last video is I subdivided this twice and then dissolved some of the vertices and then used the loop tools to create evenly spaced edges. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is subdivide these verts once and then take a look at the operator panel. Right at the top here we have an option to change the number of cuts, and if we bring that up to 2 we will get our 3 edges and they're all spaced apart evenly. The next tip is about rotation. If you remember, we selected these polygons here and used inset, and then I used the loop tools to create a circle, and it wasn't aligned with the rest of the geometry here. You can use snapping with rotation, so you don't need to eyeball things when you rotate these polygons to line them up with the geometry of the hexagon shape here. And all you need to do is go up to the Mix tab, and right here at the bottom under the effect section, switch on rotate. And now I can hit the R key to rotate here in the top view, hover my mouse over this top vertex and then hold down Ctrl to snap the circle to the geometry of the hexagon. And as you can see, this totally blows up in my face, and the reason is because of my snap settings. If I go to my Mix tab here, the Blender default is increment for snap to closest for snap width, and down here in the effect section only move is selected by default. I've changed these snap settings around a bit, and I'm actually using pretty much the same setup that I'm using in Cinema 4D, which works a lot better for me than just the default settings in Blender. But in this particular case, active is a problem here, so I need to change that to closest, and then I can again hit the rotate key, hover over this top vertex here and hold down Ctrl and left click, and the circle will be aligned exactly with the geometry of that hexagon. And if I wanted to do this with active selected here, it's not the best way. Closest is the faster way, but what I could do is switch to vertex mode, and I need to shift and left click twice on this vertex here to make it the active vertex, because I've set the snap settings here to snap with the active element, and then the rest is the same as before. Hit R for rotate, hover over this top vertex here and hold down Ctrl and left click to line these vertices up with the geometry of the hexagon. The last tip is about non-planar polygons, and that's a good one. Let me just zoom in here and rotate the scene around a bit. So let's tab back into object mode, and I'm going to select this bolt over here. And you remember we had these non-planar polygons. You can see the weird shading here, and there's an easier way to fix those, and we don't need to eyeball things like I showed you in the previous video. So what we need to do is tab into edit mode, and I'm going to select the faces here at the top right away. And if you take a look at the overlays option down here at the bottom, you have a shading section. And we have an option that says mesh analysis. We can check that. And by default, the type is set to overhang. We need to change that to distortion. So let me just try that again. It doesn't seem to work because I have my screencast program running here and it's getting in the way of things. So let me just do that again and change that to distortion. And you can see the non-planar polygons are displayed in a different color compared to the rest of the polygons here. And what we can do now is grab these top polygons here and just move them up until the color turns to gray. And if I don't want to move these polygons up this far, I can move them back down a little bit, and these polygons here get distorted again, and we can use the S key and scale these until they turn gray. I'm going to switch off mesh analysis again. And that's it as far as the tips are concerned that I wanted to share with you. Now let's go ahead and open our bolt scene. I've already prepared a second file for part 2 of this tutorial. I'm not going to save this one. And this file is for rendering a wireframe of the subdivided geometry. So let's go ahead and prepare everything for rendering. I'll just rotate this around like so. First of all, I'm going to select this bolt here, and you don't need to do that if you don't want to. I'll just make it the same height as the other bolt over here. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, switch to vertex mode, and hit the Z key and go to wireframe so we can select through the object. And then I'm going to select all of these verts here, and I'm going to snap them to the top of the other bolt here. And because I have my mix settings set to active here, I need to make one of the top vertices the active vertex. So shift and left click twice on one of these top verts. And now all I need to do is move these vertices up, move my mouse over to here and hold down the control key. And because I have also set vertex and edge center here as my snapping default, these verts will snap to any of the, I just need to snap to any of the points or edges on the top of the second bolt here. Let's go back to solid mode here, and I'll just move this over back here again. And I'll tab into object mode again. And the next thing I want to do is add a floor and a camera. So let's go ahead and hit Shift A and add a plane as our floor. I'm going to use S to scale this up a little bit. And I'm also going to hit F5. For you, that's the F2 key, I think, because I want to rename this to floor. And I'll do the same thing with the second bolt here. So F5, and I'll call this bolt MP for mid poly. And maybe let's rotate the view and pan it around and do something like this. So I want to render from this angle here. Next, I'm going to hit Shift A and add a camera. And I want to move this camera to my view position. And I'm going to use a special pie menu for that. That is not activated by default in Blender. If you want to do the same thing, you need to go to Edit and Preferences and Add-ons. And look for pie, and you will find the interface 3D viewport pie menus. If you activate those and unfold them and unfold this menu here, you will find a ton of additional pie menus that you can use in Blender. All of these will be activated, and I'm not using any of these except for the last one, which is the view numpad pie, and the hotkey for that is Alt Q. The reason I like this is because I only need to remember one shortcut, which is Alt Q, and I get a ton of options here. So I can, for example, switch to all of the orthographic views. I have some camera options here on the left and some framing options. And we can also isolate objects here on the right side. What we need for this video is the camera options, and the option I need right now is the cam to view option. So I'm going to click on that, and that will move the camera to my view position. I'm going to hit Alt Q again and lock the camera to my view, and now I can zoom out a little bit and pan around and frame my scene here, something like this. And then I'll just do an Alt Q again and unlock the camera. So now we can just rotate out of the camera. And you can also use this menu to switch into the selected camera, or use the same button, View Cam, to switch out of the camera again. I'll just move into my camera again and hit the home key, which will frame the camera view in the scene, and then I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. We also need some basic textures here. I'm going to switch to material preview mode and maybe go to my shading tab here. Let's use something for the lighting that is a little more neutral or desaturated, maybe something like this. And then I'm going to select one of the bolts here, and let's go to the material properties. On the properties panel, we need to create a new material here, and we'll just do something very basic. So I'll change the color of this to maybe something bluish, something like this, maybe make it a little bit darker. And I'm also going to add reflections. I'll crank this up all the way to 1, and I'll keep the roughness at 0.5. I don't want this to be super reflective or anything. And maybe let's make this a little bit brighter by changing the color around and moving this up a little bit, something like this. Let's go ahead and go to the overlays and switch off wireframe. And I think I'm going to just make this a little bit brighter. So something like this should be fine. And I want the same material for the second bolt. If I select it, we're still in the material properties here. We don't need to create a new material. We can click on this little drop down arrow here, and if we do that, we can see a list of all the materials in your scene. So let's go ahead and select this material for the second bolt as well. And then I'm going to select the floor, and for this one we'll need a new material. I'm going to change the color to something yellowish, orangey, maybe something like this. Okay, and again I'm going to add reflections, and for this one I think I'll bring the roughness down a bit to 0.4 or something. Right now we can't really see what the reflections look like because it's not the rendered preview. So let's go ahead and switch to a rendered preview. And because we don't have any lighting in our scene yet, we can't really see how this looks. I want to light the scene with an HDR image, so let's go to the world properties here. And under the surface tab, we can click on color and pick an environment texture, and then we can open an HDR image using the open button here. And all you need to do is navigate to your folder where you saved your HDR images. I have this set up as a favorite folder here to be able to access it more quickly. And I'm going to add an indoor lighting here. All of these HDR images are from Polyhaven and free. The one I'm going to use here is the Adams Place Bridge. And if we just need an HDR image for lighting, we don't need a high-res image. We can use a 1K image. It'll use a lot less memory. If you want a sharp background and crisp reflections, you'll need a higher res image, but for rendering our wireframe, we only need a 1K image. So I'm going to use the Adams Place Bridge with a resolution of 1K here. I'll just double click on that to add it to the scene. And that actually looks quite nice. I don't think I want to change anything here. And we don't have a lot of options in the world properties to change anything about this HDR image except for the strength. One of the things you might want to do is have the lighting come from a different direction, and in that case you'll need to go to the shader editor and add a couple of nodes to be able to do that and rotate the HDR image around. So let's go ahead and I'll hover my mouse in between the viewport and the outliner or the properties panel, and you can see my cursor changes into this double arrow, and now I can right click and do a vertical split or a horizontal split. I'll do a vertical one. And now we have an additional viewport. We need to go to the editor type up here and change that to shader editor. And up here we need to change from object to world. And now we can see the nodes for our HDR image here. And I'm going to hit N to hide the panel on the side and zoom in a little bit. Right now we can't rotate the HDR image yet. We need to add a couple of nodes, and we'll do that using the free Node Wrangler add-on. That's also part of Blender, but that's one of the add-ons that is not active or activated by default. So let's go to the add-ons and type in node, and Node Wrangler is the one that you want. So just check it to activate it. And now we can select this node here. And with this node selected, we can hit Ctrl and T, and this will add 2 more nodes. One of them is the mapping node. And this will allow us to rotate the HDR image along the Z-axis here to change the lighting. But I don't think I want to do that, so I'll just hover over this field here and hit the backspace key to reset it to 0. And then I'm going to hover my mouse in between these viewports, right click and select join areas, and I'm going to join them over to this side here. Setting up HDR images like this is a bit of a pain if you have to do it every time you have a scene and you want to do that. So I'm actually using a plugin for this, and you might want to take a look at this right now. I think it's one of the add-ons for Blender that's on sale on BlenderMarket. BlenderMarket currently has a sale going on that will continue until Monday, the 30th of August 2021. The plugin that I'm using to set up my HDR images is called Gaffer Light and HDR Manager. And once you've installed it, you will get some options on the end panel. There's a Gaffer tab here. And the end panel is mostly for manipulating or changing lights that you have added in your scene. We don't have any, we only have the HDR image, so we don't need the end panel here. And the plugin is also added to the world properties. If I scroll down a little bit, well, actually I don't need to scroll down. You can see I have an HDRI option here. And this is the Gaffer plugin. All I need to do here is activate it, and the image I used before will be overwritten. If I do that, I can always change back and go back to the original image here. But if I switch that on, I get immediate access to all of my HDR images here in this browser, and I can use the arrow keys on the left and on the right to switch between images. Down here, I also have an option to change to different resolutions. So if you have downloaded different versions of the same HDR image, you can switch between those directly here in the viewport, which is awesome. And we also have an option to rotate the HDR image right here in the viewport without the need to go to the shader editor and set up additional nodes. And it's a fairly simple plugin to use. It's super useful, and I bought it for I think 20 bucks. It doesn't come with any HDR images, but that's not a problem. Just download HDRs from Polyhaven, which has the best HDR images, and it's free. So that's a really great plugin. It also has some advanced options which can be useful to change the background. For the render we'll be doing, we don't really need good reflections and we won't be rendering the background. But I just want to show you something. If I rotate out of my camera here, and you can see this is what a low resolution HDR image looks in the background. It's totally blurred. So if you want to render the HDR image as a background as well, you'll need a higher res HDR image. And the same goes for reflections. And one of the nice things about this plugin is that under the advanced options, there is an option to create a high-res JPEG background from the HDR image that you're using. And you can also use that for reflections. And I think I already created a JPEG image from this one, so I'll just pick some other HDR image here, which is also blurred. And you can see here it's also a 1K image. And of course, if I have a higher res image, I can switch to that, and the background will look sharper. So 4K would do the trick here. But if you don't have that, let's say you just have this low res HDR image here, what you can do is check the high-res JPEG background. And if you need this for reflections as well, you can do that by checking this option. And right now, we don't have a high-res JPEG background, and we get this message here that no JPEGs have been created yet. And you can do that with that plugin. If I click on Generate JPEGs, The plugin will do that for me, and you can see now we have a sharp background and we will also get crisp and nice reflections. And the best part is that it usually takes less memory than using an 8K or 16K HDR image to get the same result. So just a tip I thought you might find useful. Like I said, it is $20 that you need to spend, but it was totally worth it for me just, to get direct access to my HDR collection and to be able to rotate the image, which is the two things that you probably want to do a lot. For this video, we're not going to use this add-on though, so I'm just going to switch that off and we're back to the image that we added before, and I'll just rotate this around again a little bit, and I'm going to hit Alt-Q and go back into my camera view. Before I set up the Freestyle wireframe render, there's a couple of things I want to do, and one of them is in the output properties all the way at the top, I'm going to switch the dimensions to 50% of the HD format that I've set as my rendering resolution here. I'll change that to 50%, and that will just speed up the test renders I'll be doing here in the viewport. I would also like to quickly talk about my render properties here. I'm using cycles. Actually, I'm using K-cycles, but you don't need to worry about K-cycles. You can use the same settings that I'm using here. K-cycles, by the way, is my second add-on tip. Currently, it also is on sale on BlenderMarket. You can get it for $36, $37, I think. K-cycles is great because it does really speed up your renders, and everything I'll be rendering in this video, I've tested that, will take half the time it took with Blender cycles. And also K-cycles produces better quality in many renders without the need to crank up the samples. You can actually use a lower sample count in many renders and get a great result. And that is especially true if you use effects like volumetrics, for example. Anyway, I'm using cycles, and the device I'm rendering with is the GPU, so you want to make sure you set this to GPU and not CPU. We can ignore the K-cycles options here. As for the sampling, I'm going to keep this at the Blender default, which is 128 for the render samples and 32 for the viewport samples. What I like to do is switch on adaptive sampling. This helps to speed up your renders if you have areas with little or no detail, like the floor here, for example. As for denoising, if you're not using K-cycles, I would recommend to stick with the Blender defaults. For me, trying to use optics for denoising for the renderer and for the viewport was a big problem with Blender cycles. Blender would freeze in the viewport and the render basically would never start. So if you want to switch that to optics, I would recommend that you save your file first, because there's a chance you'll have to shut down Blender manually and you don't want to lose your work. So if you're just using Blender cycles, you should be fine with a default denoising option, which is NLM for the render and automatic for the viewport. But with K-cycles, I can now use optics and it works just fine. So now let's go ahead and set up the Freestyle render. And there's a couple of things we need to do here. One is we need to change some settings in the view layer properties. And if you go to the view layer properties, and I'll just scroll up and hold down Control and left click on this first tab here, and that will close all of the tabs except the one that I clicked on. Now, with Freestyle enabled, you will have a couple of additional options here. We don't see those yet because we need to activate Freestyle, and we can do that in the render properties. Down here, almost at the bottom, you have a Freestyle option. We just need to check the box here to activate that. And if I unfold this tab, we only have a couple of options here. We're going to keep everything at the default. The only thing we might be changing later on is the line thickness. And once we've switched on Freestyle in the render properties, we can go to the view layer properties. And if I fold everything again, you can see that now we have a couple more options here in the view layer properties. The only ones that we need is the Freestyle line set options. You might need to go into Freestyle, which is the first Freestyle option here, and maybe change the crease angle. sometimes certain edges don't get rendered, and the reason might be because the angle is too low or too high, so sometimes you will need to change the crease angle here. I don't really know much about freestyle rendering yet, so we're going to skip the freestyle line style section completely. There's a ton of options here where you can change things about how the freestyle render looks. The only thing we need for our simple isoparm or isoline wireframe render in other software, this sort of rendering, if I switch my wireframes back on, rendering these lines are called isolines or isoparms in Cinema 4D, for example. So we're going to do a render of these lines here, and in order to be able to render the subdivided base geometry lines, we need to change only one thing basically. So if you open this Freestyle line set tab, you can see a ton of options. We can leave everything at the default, and down here in this section, all we need to do is switch on edge mark. Everything else we can leave at the default. The difference, by the way, between silhouette and contour is that contour is basically the same as silhouette, it just doesn't render as many lines as silhouette, so there usually is no need to switch that on additionally or switch silhouette off and contour on. So with these settings, I'm going to hit F12 to do a render, and this should only take a couple of seconds. And you can't really see much, so we're definitely not getting a wireframe render yet, and you can see that we're getting some lines here, and that's because of the silhouette option, which is checked here. So we're getting some lines up here and basically the outline or contour of the object. And contour, the only difference between silhouette and contour is that contour wouldn't render these lines here on the circular shape, but it would render the outline of the object. So in order to be able to render these lines, we need to check edge mark, which we have done already, but Blender still doesn't know which edges we want to render. So what we need to do here is select one of the bolts, tab into edit mode, and then switch to edge mode and hit A to select all of the edges, and then right click and pick the Mark Freestyle Edge option down here. And when we do that, all of the selected edges will turn green. And if we do another render now, so I'm hitting the F12 button again, and this shouldn't take much longer than the previous render. And now you can see the wireframe of the object is being rendered. But you can also see that some of the edges don't get rendered. And that's because Blender cannot render the edges that are created by the bevel deformer, which means that we need to apply the bevel deformer and also mark the edges that will be created as freestyle edges. And at this point, you might want to save your file as a new file, or at least make a copy of your bolts to keep the non-destructive version of those objects. I'm not going to do that though. I just switch back to object mode. We need to do that in order to be able to apply the bevel modifier. And then I'm going to just apply the modifier, tab back into edit mode, hit A to select all the edges. You can see we have some orange edges now. These are the new ones that have been created after we applied the bevel modifier, and we need to right click and choose Mark Freestyle Edge again. And now if we do a render, we should get the complete wireframe of this object. And there we go. So now we can do the same thing with our second bolt here. Select it, apply the bevel modifier, tab into edit mode, select all the edges and use Mark Freestyle Edge. And there we go, that's our wireframe render here. The quality of the lines you get for the render, and you can't really see that in this image because it's too small, is, from what I've seen, it's defined by two things basically. One is the level of subdivisions you choose for the subdivision surface modifier. In this case, this is the default. It is set to 2. It won't be enough to make these edges really look smooth in a higher res render. So I'm going to crank this up to 3 for both objects. And the other thing that defines the quality of these lines is the samples you use for rendering. and I'm going to switch that to 32, which is the same as the viewport samples, just so you can see the difference. And maybe I'll also just quickly demonstrate this by changing the subdivision surface modifier to 1 for the render. And I'll also change the output to 100%. And this render will take 15-17 seconds, so I'll just pause the video and get back when the render is finished. So here we go. This is our wireframe render in HD format, and you can see the lines look jagged and they also look very noisy. And the reason they look jagged is because the subdivision surface modifier, or the levels for the subdivision surface modifier, are not set high enough. And the reason these edges look noisy is because we're not using enough samples. I'm going to switch to slot 2 here, and we're going to change the subdivision surface modifier to 3 for both objects. And I'm also going to change the samples for rendering to 128, which is the Blender default. For this render, it'll be enough. And I'm going to do another render, and I'll be back in a couple of seconds. So here we are. You can see this render took about 16 seconds, and the lines look a lot smoother and they don't look noisy anymore. If you compare that to the first render we did, you can clearly see the noise and how jagged the edges look by comparison. So that's basically it. It's actually pretty simple to do these nice looking wireframe renders in Blender using Freestyle. There is one more tip I would like to share with you before I sign off, and what I want to share with you is how to solve a problem I accidentally came across when doing wireframe renders. I'm going to switch to slot 3 here, and in order to reproduce that problem, I'm just going to go to my output properties here, and I'll change the resolution to 1280 by 720. And I'll do another render here. And there we go. And you can see the lines look totally ugly. And it took me forever to figure out what the problem is. And the problem seems to be that this is a display glitch of some sort. And in order to fix that problem, all you need to do is either zoom in to the image a little bit or zoom out of the image a little bit. So I'm using the scroll wheel here to zoom in a little bit. And then I'm going to just zoom back to 100% of the image resolution, and there you go. You have nice and smooth lines again. So I just thought I'd share this with you just in case this happens to you too. And there's one more thing I want to change about this render, and I'll open another slot here to do that. What I want to do is I'll go back to 1980 by 1920, sorry, 1920 by 1080. To HD format. What I want to change is the line thickness. So I'll go back to my render properties here, scroll down and go to my Freestyle section, and I'll change this to 0.8 maybe. And I'll do a final render, and I'll see you in a couple of seconds. So here we go. That is my final render of these two bolts. If you compare it to slot number 2, yeah, not that much difference, but I think the lines look a little bit nicer if they're a little bit thinner than before. So this is the end of this bolt tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.